You're here because you like to really get to the heart of things, right?
Yeah, getting into it.
You like to take some pretty dense material and pull out the ideas that really sing to you.
That's right.
That give you those aha moments without leaving you feeling totally overloaded.
That's what we're all about.
Yeah, that's what we try to do here.
Exactly.
And today's material is really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
We're going to be exploring chapter 40.
Okay.
The BFG Handbook,
All right.
which is subtitled The Christian Edition of the Tao Te Ching.
So we've got a blend here.
It's a blend. It's a really unique perspective.
Yeah, interesting.
Looking at the Christian gospel through the wisdom of the Tao Te Ching.
Very cool.
So our goal today in this deep dive is to unpack the central themes of this chapter.
All right.
Which is titled Cycle of Life. We're going to be looking at these ideas of return-yielding being and non-being. And considering not just how this handbook presents them within a Christian framework,
right,
but also what deeper spiritual truths they might point to for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think, even just starting with that title, Cycle of Life, it draws you in right away. You think, okay, well, what does that mean for life to actually operate in cycles?
Yeah.
And what role does something like a divine power have in that continuous process?
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
So I think that's where we really need to start.
Yeah, so the first idea that this chapter introduces is this concept that the movement of God is returning.
Okay.
And when I first encountered that, it immediately sparked a connection for me with the biblical idea that everything originates from God and ultimately returns to him. You see this in Ecclesiastes, for instance, where it talks about how everything you know comes from dust and returns to dust. It's a very sort of fundamental understanding.
Yeah, it's like a core truth almost. And I think the handbook very specifically is drawing that connection. But what I think is so interesting here is that it's framing this return not just as an eventual endpoint.
Right.
Okay, everything's going to end up back where it started.
Right.
But it's presenting it as an active, ongoing movement of God. It's suggesting a real intentionality behind this cyclical nature. What implications do you think that might have for us?
Yeah, that's a great question.
How we view our own lives.
It makes you wonder if the challenges and detours we experience aren't just random, but are part of this larger movement back towards something, And the handbook then links this idea of returning to God with repentance and reconciliation. It even uses the parable of the prodigal son.
Right.
That very powerful story in Luke where the son who'd gone astray comes home.
Everyone knows that story.
And is met with this incredible love and forgiveness.
Yeah.
It really brings home this idea of restoration being at the heart of that return.
I think the prodigal son is just such a great image for that, just about a physical journey back. It's really a transformation of the heart. Father's joy in welcoming him back really highlights that restorative power inherent in this idea of returning to the divine.
Yeah. And it's interesting because this leads into what the handbook calls the renewal section, which is kind of a framework for how to actually live out these principles.
Right.
And so it's got a mindset, an aim, a practice, and a respond.
Okay.
And under mindset for this idea of returning, it talks about embracing God's ongoing movement.
Right.
The idea here is trusting that God is constantly working towards unity and peace in the world. There are verses like 2 Corinthians 5:18 about the ministry of reconciliation. And Revelation 21:5, God says, "Behold, I make all things new." What really resonates with you about that emphasis on it being an ongoing movement?
I think what's fascinating to me is that it introduces this real sense of dynamism. It's not like God is static. It's not like a static deity.
Right.
But it's a God who's actively involved in this process of renewal. And so it suggests that even in moments where things feel stagnant or maybe even like they're declining, there's this underlying current of divine energy that's working towards restoration.
Yeah, I like that it's a much more active image. And then the aim connected to this is divine movement and restoration.
Okay.
Which encourages us to not just observe this happening, but to actively participate in God's work of healing and bringing things back into harmony.
I see.
It mentions Acts 3:21 about the restoration of all things and Romans 8:21 about creation being set free from decay.
So it's a real call to action then.
It is. It's a call to action. It moves us from being passive recipients to active agents in this movement.
Yeah. And then the practice is aligning with God's movement.
Okay.
Which is all about discerning his will and then actively taking part in that restoration. Going back to Romans 8:28, and 2 Corinthians 5.18,
Yeah.
reminding us that God works for good in all things.
Right.
And that he's entrusted us with this ministry of reconciliation.
So it's about making that conscious choice to be part of the healing process.
Absolutely. And I think what's really interesting is that the respond section here points out how a variety of different religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, all have these parallel teachings about a future restoration, this return to a state of ultimate peace and order.
Okay.
So, whether it's Christians looking forward to the return of Christ, Muslims anticipating the coming of the Mahdi, Hindus believing in the return of Vishnu in a new age, or Buddhists seeking that ultimate release of nirvana, there's this underlying shared hope of a divine hand eventually setting things right.
Yeah, it really speaks to this idea of like a universal longing for harmony, doesn't it?
It really does. Despite all the different ways that we express our spirituality, this common thread of a divinely guided return to a more perfect state is really powerful.
Yeah, it's a powerful idea.
Okay, so let's move on to the second core idea that the chapter presents.
Okay.
Which is that the way of God is yielding. Now, I know when you first hear the word yielding, it might sound a bit passive, but the chapter clarifies that it's more about this gentle, yet ultimately sovereign approach of God.
Okay.
It links this to God's patience and mercy, referencing the story of Jonah in chapter 3, where God withholds the destruction of Nineveh after they repent. That's a really powerful image of divine yielding, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it really demonstrates that divine power isn't always about forceful intervention.
Right.
It's often manifested as this restraint, an allowance for change and growth.
Yeah. And the chapter emphasizes that this yielding isn't about weakness. It's actually this really profound humility that allows God's power to work through believers in sometimes unexpected ways. Referencing Psalm 37, where we're told to trust in the Lord and wait patiently for him.
Right.
It makes you think about how different that is from how we often see human power operating.
Yeah, it's true. We tend to associate power with dominance and control.
Exactly.
But this idea of divine yielding suggests a different kind of strength. It comes from letting go and trusting.
Right.
And the chapter emphasizes that yielding involves surrendering our need to be in control and trusting God's plan even when it doesn't make sense to us.
Yeah, when it doesn't align with our own desires.
Yeah. And the renewal section here speaks to the mindset of practicing the yielding way of God. Highlighting the importance of cultivating humility and gentleness.
How easy do you think it is for us to actually embrace this kind of yielding in our everyday lives?
It's a challenge, right?
It is a challenge.
Because our natural inclination is often toward...
to grasp for control.
Yeah, and to push our own agendas.
Yeah, exactly.
And so embracing a mindset of yielding really requires a shift in perspective.
Right.
To recognize that true strength sometimes lies in releasing our grip and trusting in a larger plan.
Yeah, it really goes against the grain in a lot of ways.
It does. And the aim that's presented here is humble submission to God's will. Trusting his perfect plan through prayer and reflection. Again, referencing Matthew 11.29 and also James 4.7, which calls us to submit to God.
Right.
It's a reminder that our understanding is limited.
Yeah, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers.
Right.
And then the practice is yielding to God's will, which involves actively surrendering our personal desires, seeking his guidance. The verses here are James 4.7 and again Matthew 11.29. And the idea is that this isn't just a one-time thing, but it's this ongoing process of letting go and choosing to trust.
And what I find fascinating is that the respond section for this idea of yielding highlights how this concept shows up in different faiths. So Christianity emphasizes the humility of Jesus.
Right.
Islam has this concept of Islam itself, meaning submission to Allah.
Right.
Hinduism speaks of surrender in the Bhagavad Gita.
Right.
And Buddhism encourages us to let go of ego in the Dhammapada.
So we're seeing this real commonality.
Yeah, it really underscores how this value of humility and aligning oneself with a higher will seems to be like this universal spiritual principle.
It does make you wonder if that act of surrender isn't actually the key to finding peace.
Yeah.
Regardless of what you believe specifically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to the next big idea that the chapter presents, which is this idea that all things of the world are born of being.
So when you see that term being in this context, how do you interpret it?
Well, I think in the framework of this chapter, being is understood as like the divine origin of all creation. God as the ultimate source from which everything emanates. So it's about God's complete power.
Right.
And his intimate involvement in bringing the cosmos into existence.
Yeah.
And even humanity, we're formed from dust in Genesis 2.7.
Right.
And I think it fosters this natural sense of reverence for the created world.
Yeah, because if everything comes from this divine being, then there's an inherent sacredness to it all.
Yes, exactly. And that sense of inherent sacredness is really a powerful takeaway. And the renewal section echoes this with the mindset of recognizing the divine purpose in creation.
Okay.
Encouraging us to see all things as reflections of God, imbued with this intrinsic value. It really changes how you look at the world around you when you start to see it that way.
It does. It really does. It moves us beyond just this purely utilitarian view to one that recognizes this deeper inherent worth because it comes from this divine source.
And the aim then becomes recognizing God's role in creation. And this is about prompting us to live with this constant awareness of God as the source of everything.
Yeah.
Which should naturally lead to more respect for creation.
Right.
And a sense of stewardship.
Yeah.
It ties back to Genesis 1.1 and John 1.3.
Yeah. And so the practice then follows that quite logically. It's reverence for all of creation.
Okay.
Which involves actively cultivating that mindset of divine purpose and value.
And this has some real world applications.
It does.
Like caring for the environment, respecting all forms of life.
Absolutely. It's about putting that belief into action. And
I think it's really amazing how the respond section here highlights how a lot of different faith traditions have a similar understanding. So Christianity, obviously, with Genesis 1.1.
Right.
Islam talks about this in the Quran 2.117. Hinduism has this concept in the Upanishads.
Okay.
And even Buddhism with its principle of dependent origination.
Right.
Which is all about the interconnectedness of everything.
Right.
All of these traditions have this fundamental belief in a divine or ultimate source of creation.
It really emphasizes that interconnectedness and that sacredness of the world we inhabit.
Yeah, it makes you consider our responsibility to something that is seen as inherently divine across so many different traditions.
It does. And recognizing that shared origin, I think, could really foster a deeper sense of unity and responsibility, not just toward each other, but towards the entire planet.
Absolutely.
Regardless of our specific faith backgrounds.
The beautiful thought.
It is.
Okay, so now we come to what might seem at first like the most paradoxical idea.
Yeah.
The idea that being arises from non-being.
Okay, so how does the chapter tackle this seemingly contradictory concept?
Well, it interprets it through this Christian lens.
Okay.
By connecting non-being to this theological concept of creatio ex nihilo.
Okay.
Which is the idea that God created everything out of nothing.
Right.
As described in Genesis 1.1 and Colossians 1.15:16.
Yeah, and it emphasizes God's ultimate and limitless creative power.
It does.
And this ever-present possibility of new beginnings, even where there was seemingly nothing before.
It's this idea that even in the absence of anything,
right,
in what looks like just total emptiness, divine creative potential still exists.
That's a powerful concept. And the renewal mindset here is trusting in God's creative power.
Okay.
To bring about possibilities from situations that seem utterly impossible. References Hebrews 11.3 and Romans 4.17.
And it's all about having faith in what we can't yet see.
Yeah, it makes you think about those times in your own life when something unexpected arose from what felt like a void.
Yeah, we've all had those moments, I think, where something good came out of a situation that felt hopeless.
Yeah, absolutely. And the aim that follows that is trust in the unseen work of God. Ways to bring life and growth from emptiness. Again, pointing to Hebrews 11.3 and Romans 4.17.
Yeah, so acknowledging that we don't always understand how God is working, but trusting that he is.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a tough one, but an important one.
It is. And the practice then is trust in God's ability to create from nothing. Actively choosing to trust God even when things look their bleakest.
Okay.
With Romans 4.17 and Hebrews 11.3 as our guides.
Holding on to hope.
Yeah.
Even when logic might tell us not to.
Exactly. And the respond section here points out how Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism all have these parallel concepts of existence arising from nothingness or the unmanifest. So Christianity, obviously, with Hebrews 11.3.
Right.
Islam talks about this in the Quran 2.117. Hinduism has this concept in the Bhagavad Gita of creation coming from the unmanifested. And Buddhism has this idea of emptiness or shunyata.
Right.
It really highlights this profound mystery surrounding the origin of existence and this immense creative power that's just beyond human comprehension.
Yeah. It makes you feel pretty small.
It does.
You know, when you start contemplating such vast creative power.
You realize the limits of what we can grasp with our human minds.
Right.
Exactly.
So as we bring this deep dive into Chapter 40 of the BFG Handbook to a close, we've journeyed through these core concepts.
Right.
This idea of the cyclical nature of life pointing towards a return to God.
Right.
The strength and wisdom in yielding to the divine will. This profound understanding that all creation springs from a divine source.
And this almost miraculous truth that being can emerge from non-being.
It's amazing how these ideas, while they're framed in a Christian context, find these echoes and resonances across a variety of different spiritual traditions.
Yeah, we saw that with each of the respond sections.
Exactly. And it speaks to the fact that these are fundamental insights into the nature of existence and our place within it.
It encourages us to look for those underlying connections, you know, and appreciate the different ways that people seek to understand these deep questions about life and meaning, to see that common ground that runs beneath our diverse spiritual paths.
So for you, our listener, take a moment to really think about these ideas. How do you see this cycle of life playing out in your own experiences? Where in your life might you benefit from practicing a little more of that divine yielding?
Okay.
Or maybe placing more trust in those unseen possibilities.
That might come from what currently feels like nothingness.
And here's a final thought to carry with you.
Okay.
Considering this idea that being arises from non-being, what non-being or seemingly empty space in your own life might actually hold the greatest potential for unexpected growth, for those really transformative new beginnings that you can't even imagine yet?
That's a great question to ponder. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
On this deep dive.
See you next time.